firstly, thank you. Thank you for gathering to come before the Lord as the Word of God commands us to continue together until Jesus Christ comes back. And then secondly, it is just to tell the overarching theme of our day, which is the grace of God. And thank you very much, worship team, for leading us into worship, really speaking about the grace of God for our lives. With that said, let us turn our Bibles to a minor prophet in the Old Testament. His name is Hosea. Let's turn our Bibles to Hosea chapter 3. We'll read the whole chapter, but don't worry, it's only 5 verses long, so we'll read from verse 1 to verse 5 of Hosea chapter 3. Hosea chapter 3 from verse 1 to verse 5, it reads as follows. And the Lord said to me, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, and a homer and a lethek of barley. And I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man, so will I also be to you. For the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord, and to his goodness in the latter days." And the saints say, Amen. You may take your seats, saints. Now, this is a very interesting text to be preaching on when we are talking about grace. Because firstly, Hosea was a prophet, and he had a task that I'm sure none of us would want to, or rather volunteer to do. He had a task of pronouncing judgment upon an Israel nation that was very prosperous, a time when Jeroboam II, the son of Joash, was king. Now, even though Israel was very prosperous, in other words, it expanded a bit, and diplomatically it was sound. They had diplomatic agreements with their neighbors that were structured and engineered by Jeroboam, and Jeroboam ensured that there was at least progress in Israel. He reigned for 41 years, but the Bible does tell us in 2 Kings, in chapter 14, that Jeroboam was an evil king who led Israel to further wickedness. So even though there was success, there was prosperity, he was still evil. So God did not take away the success or the prosperity from Israel, even though they were evil. Now, as part of his message, that is Hosea, the prophet was called, as our text says, he was called to love. You can almost call it, if you want, a love story. We have a glimpse of a love story, albeit a very strange one. It's one in which might not agree with our understanding of love today. For Hosea in this story, his choice was not based on the woman's beauty or the woman's words or companionship or how Hosea felt in her midst. No, his choice was actually forced upon him by God. You could call it was an arranged marriage. Now, I'm sure if we were to imagine, those of us who are still single and not married, if we were to imagine an arranged marriage, God would be probably the best person to arrange a marriage for us. Because we would probably think that, God knows me, and God probably, would have, pick the most beautiful person, a person from a God-fearing family, a person who perhaps even fears God and does the work of the Lord. And you probably you wouldn't be wrong for thinking that. But here we have a case where God sends Hosea not to a God-fearing woman, not to a woman who comes from a family that fears God, not to a woman who has a great status in society. Rather, he says, go to a woman who's an adulterous woman. Now, I don't know about you, but if this was not in the Bible, I would not have believed that God had sent Hosea. I'll be honest with you. The only reason why I believe that God sent Hosea is because it's in the Bible. I'm just being honest. If someone were to say to me, God has called me to go and marry a harlot, I would say, you're out of your mind. You are talking just rubbish. But because it's in the Bible, I am forced to kind of believe that Hosea was indeed sent by God. Now, in Hosea, we see that God doesn't just use Hosea's message or his words for his prophetic office. He also uses his life and his family. God extends his message to Israel by using Hosea's words along with Hosea's life and his family. Now, this was in line, obviously, with many of God's prophets who were used by God. Think of the likes of Isaiah, who was called by God. He was actually instructed by God to walk naked and barefoot for 3 years. And you're probably wondering, why would God do that? So that he would show to the Egyptians and the Assyrians what would happen to them, that God would make them walk barefoot and naked. Again, God called Jeremiah, and he said to Jeremiah that, in fact, he commanded him to avoid funerals and forsake marriage. Now, it is safe to say this was before the pandemic, so many of us would not have avoided funerals, but he was told to do this and not marry, which is strange because Jeremiah told those who would go to captivity that they should marry. So why would God say that? Well, God told him to do this as a sign to those who refused to believe Jeremiah that they should go, those who wanted to stay in Judah, that this is what would happen to you. You would die and you would lose your families. A third one is Ezekiel. He was told by God not to weep for his deceased wife. Again, that was a message for Judah. So it's not a strange thing for God to use the prophets and their lives as an extension of their message. But this is a strange one. Because here we witness a charge for Hosea to return to a woman, to not only walk for a period of time like Isaiah, but to actually be with this woman forever. A woman who loves other men. A woman who enjoys the company of other men. And God does not say, Hosea, go, and not tell him about this woman. He gives him this woman's profile. But he still says, go. So in Hosea's search and reconciliation with this woman, we see Israel's reconciliation with God. Now allow me to title this our text for today and call it Love and Raisin Cakes. Love and Raisin Cakes. To build our text, we will have 3 parts. The first one is the cost of love. We will talk about the cost, or rather the cost to love. I apologize for that. The cost to love is the first point. The second point is the cost of this love. That is the cost of this love. And then the third and final point is the hope of this love. So if we go to our text, the first 2 verses of chapter 3 inform us about the cost to love. Here we have Hosea, who is told by God not just to bring back this woman, but to love this woman. He is told not just to be friendly with this woman, but he is told to actually enact this. He is told to take the initiative. And he's told to do this not because God has a sense of humor or God wants Hosea to suffer. The reason why he's saying this is because he wants to send a message to Israel. Because this woman that Hosea is going to, that is Gomer, as chapter 1 informs us, this woman is a woman sold to harlotry. In fact, she's worse than that. This is a woman who enjoys the company of other men so much that she's willing to leave the safety and the sanctuary of Hosea's bosom to be with other men. It tells us it's a strange thing, this cost for Hosea, because God tells Hosea a strange thing. He says, love someone, if I were to paraphrase it, who doesn't love you. So chase after someone who's running after someone else. Now, those who have grown up in the farms or have spent some time there know that there is that time when we need to eat, and most of us love chicken. And when you're at the farm, you don't go to the store to get your chicken. You actually have to chase the chicken. It's a very, very difficult thing to chase a chicken if you have no skill to chase a chicken. I'm a city boy, raised in the city. I'll admit, I'll never chase a chicken. I am not crazy enough to chase a chicken because I know I will not catch a chicken. Here we have Hosea called to chase a chicken and not give up on chasing this chicken. And he's not called to eat this chicken. He's called to take care of this chicken. It's an interesting cost because he is called to lower his status as a prophet, go to a woman who is comfortable and most probably is not even in his presence. A woman who's probably left this man. If we were to take a step back and look in chapter 1, this woman gave birth to two sons and a daughter for Hosea. One of the children is called Not My People. The other is called no mercy. So he is called to go back to this woman who has caused so much pain to Hosea. Yet Hosea has to stomach this pain and go back, lower himself, and you could almost say, buy this woman. He's not called to command this woman to come back, because this woman right now does not belong to him. So the cost here for Hosea, one might say, is an emotional cost. A cost is also a financial cost. There's also a cost as well, which is his reputation. I'm sure you can imagine those who were living in the community as they were looking at Hosea. They were probably laughing at Hosea. Look at this prophet who says he's coming from God, yet his own wife. Oh, sorry, did I say wife? That woman over there who's now with Jim or James. I don't know. Last night she was with James. Tomorrow she might just be with Paul. Heck, I even came there myself a few weeks ago. You can even imagine that at the well when people go to gather the water, Hosea is probably the talk of the town. Check that prophet. Ha. So here we have Hosea. Going to this woman at a cost. And it tells us that he paid 15 shekels of silver, a homer, and a lethek of barley. Now, we can say all we may about the cost that was paid for this woman, but one thing is for sure, this is trying to tell us that this woman, she had lost her worth. Basically, this was a woman who had lost her. Why am I saying this? The Bible tells us in Exodus that the cost of a slave girl is actually 30 shekels of silver. That is to redeem a slave girl. Here, Hosea is called to redeem this woman on 15 shekels of silver, a homer, and a lethek of barley. Yes, this was a huge cost for Hosea, but it showed how low this woman had gone in terms of her status. So she was virtually a slave. A slave. She was not just a prostitute who enjoyed now. She enjoyed her doing so much that she was a slave to this life. Kind of reminds us of Paul, as it says in Romans chapter 7, I know not what I do. That which I want to do, I do not do. But that which I do not want to do. Oh, what a wretched man that I am. A point when the sin has taken over so much. You've enjoyed it so much that it's almost second nature. You can't even live without it. Almost like our phones. We use our phones. In fact, I use my phone so much. I enjoy using my phone that I wonder, who is the master? Is it me or the phone? But this is merely an example. It's an example of God's love. For verse 2, or rather verse 1b and verse 2 inform us that God's love for Israel had not diminished. Despite Israel's lust for other gods. For the Lord brought them out of Egypt. They had forgotten that. He cared for them in the wilderness. They forgot about that. In the dry desert, when there was no water, when they were not a people, when they were not a nation, when they were infants, God cared for them. When they grew up and they gathered many things for themselves, when they saw that they were a people amongst people, they forgot the person who made them a people. Their sacrifices were polluted. Their own kings were corrupt. Their priests were the same. There was just from top down, everyone was wicked. So we see here that for Hosea to love, it came at a cost. But there's another side to this. That is the cost of this love. This love was not without discipline. For verse 3 and 4 tells us that since Hosea bought her, she was his. You could say she was his property. She belonged to him. And he says to her that you should stay with me. He in fact gives her 4 things. He says to her that you must dwell with me for many days. That's number 1. Number 2, he says you shall not play the whore. Number 3, you will belong to no other man. And number 4, he says, I will also be to you. So effectively what he's doing is that he's saying that she would lose all her privileges, all her freedoms were now gone. She didn't have them anymore. She had to dwell with Hosea for many days. Not just that, she would lose what she enjoyed the most, which was whoring around town. But more than that, she would lose her love, her desire for other women, for other men would be lost. And then fourthly, which is perhaps you could consider cruel, Hosea himself would not be engaged with her. So this marriage would, even though he would love her, it would not be a marriage that would be consummated. So she was robbed of everything that she loved. Everything that she considered her identity was stripped from her. It came at a cost. Now, this was an example for Israel, because Israel herself had corrupt leaders, perverted worship, and was involved in pagan divination. And then God would make sure she would lose all those privileges. She would have no king, no place to worship, and no place to mix pagan worship. In essence, Israel would lose her identity. Now, before I continue to the third and final point, I think it's important to note that Moses had warned about this. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 36, as well as chapter 31, verse 4, Moses had warned about what would happen if their kings had become wicked and corrupt. They themselves would lose the privilege of being kings. Israel had built up and erected strange and forbidden stones by the altar of God. Something that God himself said Israel would not do. So here we see that the problem with Israel was not just that they had forgotten about God, but they took it a step further. They mixed things and practices from their neighbors in addition to their worship to God. They broke the first law, which is you shall have no other God. So this was the cost of this love. This woman and Israel would lose their privileges. It's safe to say there would be judgment. And later, Judah suffered this, which is why Jeremiah said that indeed you will go to captivity. And then he said, but God says that this is not meant to destroy you. It's for your good, because I have a plan for you. That leads us to our third point, the hope of love. There was a cost for Hosea and God. There was a cost for Gomer and Israel. But there's also hope for the people. Verse 5 tells us of this hope, that indeed Israel would return. And Israel would not just return and be the same old Israel. They would have learned their lesson. They will fear the Lord. They won't just fear the Lord. David will once again be their king. They will not repeat their adultery, and God would respond in kindness. This restoration would not be immediate. Instead, it would take time. Now, I don't know about you, but there are still Israelites in Israel even today who are still waiting for the Messiah. They are still waiting for the fulfillment of this particular text when God would restore them and their king would come. It is a shame that they are still waiting, because First Peter tells us that God has already begun this restoration. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14 to 18 tells us that God paid a price, which was Jesus Christ himself. The price was not silver or gold. It was not anything imperishable, but it was the imperishable. It was Christ's blood which bled on the cross and paid the price for our sins. When Peter was before the Jews on the day of Pentecost, he said to them that the latter days had come. And the book of Hebrews tells us that the latter days had come, and it came with Jesus bringing the goodness of God. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the hope of this love rests upon the latter days. That's what the text says. It says the goodness of God in the latter days. And the New Testament tells us that we are in the latter days, where Paul says in Romans chapter 10, verse 1 to 4, that he's in pain praying for his brothers and sisters, that they may see this grace and receive this grace. I said my message is called Love and Raisin Cakes. The reason why, because it contrasts the two. The love of God for his people and the love of God's people for their God. God's love is eternal, it's everlasting. God's love moved him to send his own son. God's love moved him to lower himself, to come before us and be a servant, to serve us and exalt us and lift us up that we may have life. But there's a danger, saints. If we are honest, we as God's people have a raisin cake kind of love. It's very easy to forget who God is. It's very easy to forget what God has done. And in fact, when things are great, it's very easy to forget who got us there. Perhaps the book of Hosea is a warning for us that this grace that we have came at a cost. It cost God everything, his own son. And it cost us everything, our previous identity. But this grace has given us hope. This hope is that we are now called sons and daughters of God. We have a new identity. We are no longer called adulterers, idolaters and adulterers. We are no longer called harlots. We are called saints and the children of God. As I call upon Pastor Kondla to come, I want to remind you, saints. I want to urge you, saints. I want to plead with us, saints. Forget not who has gotten you here. Forget not who God is. The Old Testament says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength."